Hey there, welcome to episode 9 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how or what information to look for in a pattern if you want to modify it for gauge. So many of our previous episodes have talked about how to modify a pattern for the existing gauge that's within the pattern. Today we're going to be focusing on how to use your gauge in a sweater pattern to modify it so that it still fits you. Before we jump into today's topic, I just wanted to let you know about a little addition that I'm making to the Knit Talk episodes. On Sundays, I'm going to be creating sort of shorts. We're going to call them the Sunday Special. They'll be a little bit shorter than these weekly or the Wednesday podcasts, but they will be offering some supporting information to what we talked about during the week that maybe wasn't quite relevant or directly relevant to what we were talking about, but will be supporting information for things that'll help you on your knitting journey. So I hope you'll join me on Sundays. It will be right here on my channel, and the first episode is going to be coming this Sunday, May 14th. So the framework of today's episode is based on a question that I see very frequently from knitters who are jumping into a sweater project. Their question will go something like, I swatched for this project and the gauge is, I don't know, let's say 24 stitches over 4 inches, and I get 22 stitches over 4 inches. Can I just knit a different size in the pattern? I don't want to change my needle size because I like the fabric that I'm getting. What size can I make? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And the short answer is, yeah, of course, you can choose another pattern or another size from within the same pattern. And I'm going to talk to you about the really important things to look at to make sure that the sweater ends up the correct final size. A good example of this for me is the Shifty Sweater by Andrea Mowry. And I'm going to be referring to the 2019 version that came out 4 years ago. There has been a new version that was released with a different gauge, but when I knit my version, I was working with the original pattern's gauge. So the original pattern called for a gauge of 30.5 stitches over 4 inches. And she was using kind of a heavy fingering light sport weight yarn. And so I swatched using a sort of traditional fingering weight yarn. I was using solid colors using a brand that I love, UU Yarn's Fluffy Fingering. And when I swatched for it, I got close, but not quite right on for gauge. I got 28 stitches over 4 inches rather than the 30.5. And so that meant, people get this backwards quite frequently. So 28 is a lower number than 30.5, but that means that my gauge is larger. So my stitches were larger than Andrea's, so that means I get to knit a smaller size. And we're going to walk through this so it makes sense. But essentially, I was able to look at the finished size of what I wanted my garment to be, which was a size 4, but because of my difference in gauge, I was able to knit the instructions for size 3 and end up with a sweater that was really close in size to what the size 4 would have been. So let's talk about what you need to look at to make sure that you get a sweater that ends up being the right size, even if your gauge is different. So the very first thing that you want to look for when you're choosing what size to work from in the pattern is the total number of stitches at the widest part of the chest. So for a bottom up style sweater, this would be the total number of stitches before you separate the front and back for the yokes if you're working a drop shoulder style sweater, or it would be the total number of stitches that you have on your needle before you join the sleeves if you're working a raglan or a circular yoke style sweater. If you're working a top-down style sweater, whether it's raglan or whether it's a circular yoke style, it's going to be the total number of stitches after you separate the sleeves, because the total number of stitches after the sleeves are separated is what makes the circumference of the body at the widest part. So that's what we're looking for. Let's just take a quick look at an example from episode 6. This is a top-down raglan style sweater, and the gauge for this pattern, which is just below the blue box at the top of the page, has a gauge of 18 stitches and 26 rounds over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. But let's imagine that you have knit your swatch and you have a gauge of 19 stitches over 4 inches. While this doesn't look like a huge difference, it's different enough over the circumference of a sweater that your finished size will be different. And in this case, it will specifically be smaller because it works in reverse. 19 stitches is larger than 18, which means it takes more stitches to make 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So if you worked, say, your size 4 at that modified gauge of 19 stitches over 4 inches, your sweater would be smaller. So if your gauge number is larger, 19 versus 18, your sweater is going to be smaller. They kind of work as opposites. Okay, so let's go back to the example on the screen. We've got 3 finished sizes in the pattern. These are in the blue box in the top corner, sizes 1, 2, and 3. And the information that we're looking for is in the red box where we are dividing the sleeves from the body. As you can see from the pattern, once you've divided the sleeves out and before you start the body, we have a total of 164 stitches for size 1, 180 stitches for size 2, and 200 stitches for size 3. So since the gauge that we swatched with is smaller than the pattern originally calls for, right? 19 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters is smaller than 18 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. If we were to knit the pattern following, let's say, size 1, our sweater would end up smaller than what the pattern says it would be. Just to look at the math of that, what we're going to do is look at the stitches in the pattern once we've separated the sleeves from the body. So we will take our 164 stitches and divide it by our gauge, which is 19 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and the result is 8.63. If you are working in US units, you will multiply that by 4 to find out that the finished size is going to be roughly around 34.5 inches. If you're working in metric units, you're going to take that same 8.63 and multiply it by your 10 centimeters and find out that your finished size is around 86.3 centimeters. There's obviously a little bit of rounding in there between metric and US units. But essentially what that's telling us is that the finished size of the sweater would be 2 inches or roughly 6.5 centimeters smaller than what the pattern calls for. If we then move up to size 2 and take the result or the stitches remaining after the sleeves are divided, which is 180 stitches, and divide it by our gauge of 19 stitches, we end up with 9.47. And then of course we're going to do the same math. So 9.47 times 4 is just shy of 38 inches, or the 9.47 times our 10 centimeters is 96.5 centimeters. So the finished size will actually now be larger than what the pattern calls for. So in this case, working at your gauge of 19 stitches as opposed to the pattern gauge of 18 stitches, there isn't an exact correlation. You can't choose one size larger and get exactly the same size as size 1. You have to choose between a project that may be slightly smaller than the target of size 1 or slightly larger than the target of size 1. So let's just say that you've chosen to knit size 2 because you want it slightly larger rather than slightly smaller. And at this point, you could generally proceed with size 2 exactly as written, and it will be as close to the size 1 as you can get without having to make modifications. But there are other things that I like to look at before I start knitting a pattern for my gauge that just sort of help me or prevent me from getting tripped up before I get into trouble. So the first thing to look for once you've chosen your modified size based on your gauge is your row gauge and the depth of the yoke and how the two are going to play together. If your row gauge differs from the pattern and you have a specific number of rows that you have to knit for your size to achieve your target stitches, are you okay with the length of yoke that will result? If you have a longer row gauge than the pattern calls for, your yoke may end up being longer because of the specific number of rows you need to work, and vice versa. If your row gauge is shorter, your yoke may end up being shorter than what the pattern calls for. And you have to decide if you're okay with that. If your row gauge is shorter and your yoke will end up being shorter than the pattern calls for, you may have room to knit some extra rounds without any shaping or without any pattern work to achieve that target depth. If your row gauge is longer, you're strapped a little bit more, especially if there's very like row count specific color work or textural patterns. You may have to just have a slightly longer yoke than the pattern calls for to accommodate that gauge. The next thing that we want to look at is the upper arm circumference of the sweater. And you're going to treat this very similarly to how you treated the circumference of the body. You're going to look for the total number of stitches that you'll have on your needle after you pick up and knit all of the stitches. You want to make sure that that circumference at your gauge still works out to be the correct circumference. If it is, yay. If it's not, are there ways that you can modify the stitch counts to achieve the target stitches that you want to have on your sleeve? In episodes 3, 5, and 6 of this podcast, and I'll have links to this in the description below, I talk about how to modify sleeve counts for drop shoulder, raglan, and circular yoke style sweater, so that if you've chosen a body size but the sleeve size at your gauge doesn't quite work, you can figure out what to do there. Also pertaining to sleeves, we want to be looking at the length of the sleeve that will result. And this, again, has very little to do with your stitch gauge, but rather your row gauge. Each pattern is going to have different instructions on how to work the sleeve shaping, which is simply the way that we decrease our stitches from the upper arm down to the cuff circumference. Let's use a really basic example. Let's say the pattern says work a decrease round every 10th row 10 times. So we're going to multiply the total number of times that we're working it, which is 10, by the total spacing, which is again 10. And that tells us that our sleeve shaping will be done within 100 rounds. You can use the math to figure out, based on your row gauge, what your total sleeve length would be once those 100 rounds are done. And if the sleeve is going to end up too long, you can look at episode 3. At about the 13-minute mark of episode 3 of this podcast, I talk about how to adapt the shaping in your sleeve to fit your arm length. And that may mean you just have to work fewer rounds between the shaping of your decreases, or more, depending on your row gauge. Okay, that's kind of it for what to look for when you're modifying a pattern for your gauge. Every style of sweater is going to have slightly different factors that play into it, whether it's color work, limitations on the number of rows that you have to work, but that's a general overview of what to look for and how to choose a size in the existing pattern, just working at your own gauge. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, I've got a new Sunday special that I'm going to be talking about, or I'm going to be creating videos for. This coming Sunday, May 14th, is going to be the first the first episode, and we're going to be talking about how to make yardage estimates for modifications that you want to make to a sweater, and it's all going to come down to your gauge swatch. Next week, May 17th, is going to be a new technique tutorial, and I'm going to be demonstrating how to use the golden ratio that we talked about in episode 8 to pick up and knit stitches along the edge of your work. Quite a few people have asked for physical demonstrations of how to apply those numbers to the actual work, so I'm going to get out my needles and show you what that looks like. Since we talk about sweater modification so much, and I suspect some of you are just looking to knit your first sweater, I would encourage you to head over to my website at www.unapologeticknitter.com/MFS, as in my first sweater. You can download my free guide on how to get started and even knit your very first sweater. I think you'll find there's a little freebie in there that does sign you up for my newsletter, but you'll hear from me just once a week letting you know about what's coming. And speaking of newsletters, if you are a sweater veteran but you want to stay in touch between episodes, ask questions, get information about what I'm doing behind the scenes, I would love for you to head over and subscribe to that. Again, that's unapologeticknitter.com/newsletter to subscribe for the newsletter. And if you like this episode and feel like you learn things from my podcast, I would love for you to like this episode and subscribe to my channel. It tells the YouTube algorithms that you like what I'm doing and will refer my videos to more knitters so that we can help more people on their knitting journey. As always, if you have ideas for future discussion topics, and I know you do, I'm getting them on the daily, please feel free to click on the form link below to submit a discussion topic, because I would love to help you either in Wednesdays or on our new Sunday episodes. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you learned something, and I wish you very happy knitting.